Great. Hello everyone, how are you all doing? Great, good to see you. Thanks very much everyone for coming, and welcome to our roundtable on protesting across the divide, social movements in conflict societies. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much to our guests for being here. It's great to see you all. I see lots of students, many of my own students, and as well as some faculty and members of the wider Villanova community, so it's great to have you all here. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Cera Murtagh. I'm Assistant Professor here at Villanova in Political Science and in Irish Studies. And I'm joined today by distinguished guests and experts in this field. Nidžara Ahmetašević, an independent researcher, journalist and activist from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Siobhan Byrne from the University of Alberta. Loizides from the University of Warwick in the UK. Nagle from Queen's University Belfast, and Nagle, an Idle Family Fellow and Villanova alumnus, an independent researcher based in Brussels. So this event is the conclusion of a two-day workshop that we've been having here at Villanova over the last couple of days on social movements in divided societies, with 10 scholars altogether from different parts of the world. So we've had some really productive, really fruitful discussions about this topic, and we wanted to, but it's been kind of behind closed doors, which has been great, but we wanted to share some of those discussions with you and also engage with you on some of those issues, because we're also really interested in your perspective on these things. So this event has been a real collaboration between several centres and departments. So it's been co-sponsored by the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies, the Centre for Irish Studies, the Department of Political Science, Gender and Women's Studies, and also with very generous support from the Idle Family Fellowship, and in partnership with Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland as well. So I'd like to say a big thanks to all of those partners, and they've been wonderful. And individually, I'd like to say a huge thanks to Dr. Samar Abood, the director of the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies, who did an enormous amount of work to put this all together, and to Joseph Lennon, the director of the Centre for Irish Studies, for his support as well. Also a massive thanks to Andra Kane, Kirsten Ludi, Danielle Redden, and Jonathan O'Neill for their help in and facilitation. We couldn't have done it without them. So over the last 15 years or so, over the course of the lifetime of most of you here in this room, we've seen a kind of a new wave of protest sweep across the world, from Occupy to Black Lives Matter to Extinction Rebellion. But what this group here is interested in, and what we've been talking about over the last couple of days, is what those protest movements look like in parts of the world that are marked by war and violent conflict. Places like Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Bosnia, Cyprus, and Palestine and Israel. These are societies that we tend to refer to as deeply divided. But in spite of that, social movements have also emerged in these places. And social movements that actually reach across the divide and bring people together. This is not a new phenomenon, but we've also seen a kind of a new wave of it over the last 10 to 15 years. People have been mobilising across the divide on issues from peace to basic social and economic rights, to public services, protection and preservation of public spaces and parks, the environment, gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, language and cultural rights. And we've seen these movements have very significant impact in all kinds of different ways. Indeed, many of these movements have been led by young people and by students. So we've been thinking over the last couple of days about how and why these movements come together, despite the steep barriers that they face in these places, and what impact they can have in those conflict societies. So we're here to discuss this today with our 5 experts in the field who look at this in cases including Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Cyprus, Lebanon, and Palestine and Israel. And as our discussions today concern societies experiencing conflict and transitioning out of conflict, I'd also like to acknowledge the context that we're having this conversation in, where there are a number of wars ongoing across the world, in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ukraine, and in many other places. So this is not an abstract topic. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the almost unimaginable pain and suffering that's happening right now in Gaza. We're now almost a year into a brutal war there that has claimed the lives of more than 40,800 people. An estimated 90% of people have been displaced from their homes. Meanwhile, the people of Gaza are also suffering a major humanitarian crisis, including mass hunger and starvation, and the threat of outbreak of polio. According to the UN, 80% of schools have been destroyed or damaged in Gaza since October 7th, 2023. All 12 universities in Gaza have been destroyed, and this has been referred to as, by the UN and others, as scholasticide. Just this week, we witnessed the recovery of the bodies of 6 hostages, including the 23-year-old American-Israeli Hersh Goldberg Poland. And there are 97 hostages remaining in Gaza. So I just want to acknowledge the immense pain and suffering being experienced right now by the people in Gaza and express our solidarity as a panel with them. As teachers and scholars, and given that we're having this discussion in a university at the start of a school year, I'd also specifically like to express our solidarity with teachers, scholars and students in Gaza. And to express our solidarity with those living through and affected by war across Palestine and Israel, and Lebanon, Sudan, Ukraine, and everywhere in the world where wars are being fought right now, and the loss, pain and suffering they're experiencing. The war in Gaza is also mobilising people across the world, across all kinds of divides, and including, as we know, on college campuses, and that's something that our discussion today will touch on. So the format for today's roundtable will be that I'll start off by asking each of our participants to just introduce themselves and their research. I'll then ask them a few questions, and then I'll turn over to the floor for you to ask your questions. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Okay, great. Maybe Siobhan, if you don't mind, we'll start here and work our way down.
Thank you so much, Cera, for inviting me, for all the various people that you thanked, all the different sponsors that made an event like this happen. It was an incredibly rewarding workshop, and it's lovely to have the opportunity to chat with students now at the very end of the workshop. So thank you for that, and thank you for those opening remarks as well, and acknowledging the devastation in Gaza. So my name is Siobhan Byrne. I'm an associate professor of political science. I'm also the director of the Institute for Intersectionality Studies at the University of Alberta. My area of research is largely feminist anti-war activism and conflict resolution. I've had the opportunity to interview feminist activists who've organized across the divide, as well as organizing within their own communities in Palestine, in Israel, in Northern Ireland as well. I've also interviewed and studied and written about transnational feminist activists that are working towards peace. Some of you might be familiar with Code Pink, which was a US-based feminist peace organization that came on my radar when they became interested in Gaza. So I've had a chance to interview some Code Pink activists, and more recently, really to listen to participate in, and to help deliver teach-ins and other kinds of acts of solidarity around the conflict in Palestine and Israel today. So, very nice to be here.
Hi everyone, my name is Runa. It's very nice to be back on campus because I was a student not too long ago. I graduated in 2021 from the master's program here in political science. So Dr. Murtagh was my professor and now a colleague, so that was a nice continuation of our work. So I, after my time at Villanova, I went to Brussels and worked for a year, and then I went on a Fulbright. Thanks to Villanova for a lot of help with that, to study and continue the work that we're discussing today. So I was in Bosnia and Herzegovina for 9 months and studied LGBTQ movements and women's rights activists and women's political inclusion in post-conflict societies. So that was an absolutely amazing experience, and then I've been working with Dr. Murtagh on that also from a comparative aspect with Northern Ireland as well. So that I'll keep it short.
Thanks, Rina.
Hi, I'm Nidžara Ahmetašević. I'm coming from Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm a journalist by profession. I'm a researcher, and I kind of like became activist too along, following different topics. As a journalist, I'm writing about human rights violations, post-conflict societies, and migrations. As an activist, I have been active in different movements in the Balkans and Europe that are also dedicated in a way to human rights violations, more than anything migrations. And since recently, I'm also following movements that are related to environment protection in the Balkans region.
Hello everybody, I'm Loizides. I'm a professor in international conflict analysis at the University of Warwick. I'm also a PI along with Alison, my colleague, on a project on inclusive peace, how people endorse peace settlements in divided societies. We give cases from Bosnia, Lebanon, New Caledonia, Philippines, and Cyprus, which is also the focus of my own study. Cyprus is an island in the Eastern Mediterranean. It used to be a British colony. If you look at the maps of CNN, you can also see that some parts of the island is still British bases, and they're implicated in the war in Gaza. So it's very close to what is happening right now in Israel, Palestine. In 1960s, it became independent, but with a power-sharing settlement between Greek and Turkish Cypriots that collapsed in 1963-64. Since 1974, is de facto divided in two parts. And the mission of the peace movement that I study in my own work, the main objective is to create a federal settlement in the island. Some of the challenges for the peace movement is how do you advocate for something that has not happened for the last 50 years? How do you get people enthusiastic about something has been keep failing in the negotiations? How do you have an impact in people's everyday lives? If you cannot reach a peace settlement, how do you create confidence building measures? How do you argue for federalism? Making a case for federal arrangements for power sharing is the most difficult dialogue you can have in the Balkans, in Kiev, in Nicosia, in Beirut. And how do you coordinate across divided lines when the means of communication are simply not there?
Thanks, Neil.
Great. Yeah, hello everybody. My name's John Nagle. I'm Professor of Sociology at Queen's University, Belfast. So my research looks at social and protest movements in divided societies, particularly Northern Ireland and Lebanon. And we call these kind of places divided societies because there's divisions between groups, whether it's nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland, Shia, Sunni, Christian in Lebanon. And a lot of focus of existing research is looking at these divisions, how groups mobilize in terms of separate political parties, how there's high levels of segregation. But in my own kind of research over the last kind of 10 or 15 years, I've noticed that within these societies there are groups which actually bring people together across ethnic and sectarian divisions. So whether it's LGBT groups, feminists, labour movements, it could be anti-racist mobilizations. And this has been kind of ignored in research, but I think these movements are really important because I think they provide new models of tolerance, coexistence and diversity, which are really sort of key to sustainable peace building in these societies. So yeah, I think what we've been doing in this roundtable and workshop has been really important because we're beginning to sort of investigate and examine these alternative ways of imagining community in these particular societies.
Lovely. That's really, really lovely way to articulate it. Thanks, John. So yeah, we hear that there are so many different bases of mobilisation across the divide in the societies that we're looking at. One of the most fundamental, I suppose, and critical is our movements for peace. But the role of social movements and bottom-up activism is often kind of overlooked in peace negotiations, or when we think about peace building, we often think about elite-led, elite-dominated, high-level peace negotiations. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the impact of bottom-up movements on peace in the cases you've looked at. Perhaps maybe Siobhan and Neo, I'll ask you two to start
Sure.
on that, and others can jump in.
Yeah, I'll begin by echoing John's comments about the binary logic of deeply divided societies, which can be quite overdrawn, especially when you're paying attention to the ways in which people make meaning in their lives and conflict zones. They're organizing all the time and thinking about who they are. That doesn't fit within that logic of two communities all the time, informing all the ways in which they think about and go about their day. So perhaps one way, one story I could tell you that helps to illustrate that is the story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition Party. These were activists as well as academics and trade unionists who came together in the 1990s and they saw an opportunity to get elected to the peace talks. It was quite an unusual sort of electoral formula, which was designed to get the most intransigent, quite small parties to ensure that they were represented at the peace table. So a group of feminist activists, some of whom were fired up at a UN conference in Beijing, came back and said, you know what, within the next 6 weeks, why don't we put together a political party? And that's exactly what they did. They got elected. And they were represented by two people, Monica McWilliams, which nominally represented the nationalist Catholic community, and Pearl Sager, who nominally represented the unionist Protestant community, as a show that they were working across the divide, this particular party. So they ensured that they had a voice, a feminist voice at the table. It also ensured that it was a cross-community voice, which challenged the way in which peace was thought to be made. And they helped to ensure that that final agreement over 2 years of negotiations included world-class commitments to human rights, a Equality Commission, helped to ensure that women were named within the peace agreement as well. And that story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition helps to illustrate both the way in which activists and organizers thought about their role within a so-called deeply divided society, the way in which their work could help inform a peace process as well. And it helped to then shape some of the international discourse about how peace processes could be more inclusive. And indeed, other activists then took up the story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition as they began to advocate at the United Nations for a particular policy proposal to ensure women's representation in peace processes that the UN led on. Thanks,
One of the wrong assumptions we often make in divided societies is that victims are less likely to engage in peace activism and reconciliation efforts. The example for Cyprus is the Committee for Missing Persons. In both sides of the divide, we had approximately and proportionally to the population of both communities, 2,000 people who went missing. That meant that almost every family had someone distant who was lost either in the intercommunal fighting or the invasion of 1974. It was a drama for both communities. And for many years, each of the two communities thought they were the only ones who had missing. So cooperation on these issues seemed impossible. Since 2003, relatives found ways to mobilize across communal lines. The two sides agree in establishing a commission for the recovery of the missing. There were obstacles to that because many of the people who were involved, the perpetrators, feared that there would be persecutions, legal persecution, retaliation. It challenges the conventional wisdom and narrative of the two sides. Sometimes there are practical difficulties as well because some people went missing decades ago and people couldn't remember where the perpetrators or witnesses wouldn't remember where these people were lost. Environment changes, new roads are being built, construction public works happen. But since the last decade, when these efforts have started, more than half of the missing in Cyprus have been recovered, which is one of the largest numbers comparatively from various conflicts that we have data around the world. So now we increasingly are in a position to provide their relatives the remains of their own. We're in a position to start discussing oral history and transitional justice measures, including a truth commission. We can challenge the official narratives that only one of the two sides has been victimized, and we can start thinking in terms of a joint narrative of moving the society beyond the monolithic victimization that has been a feature of a divided society, where you interpret history only from the position of your own community. So assumption there is that the peace movement is not just activists who haven't been involved in the conflict. Sometimes victims themselves engage because they see remedies and they see self-therapy through their struggle beyond sectarianism.
Can I just jump in?
Please.
With one? Just kind of wondering how many of you here are kind of studying social movements as part of your course? One person, a few of you. So
Yeah.
I've got a, back home in Queen's University, I run a course on social movements and protests. And one of the questions I ask my students is, what sort of change do you think social movements have actually brought about? They kind of look at me and think, what? And I say, well, what about civil rights in America? The fact that women can vote, you have same-sex marriage. Do you think it's because politicians woke up one day and just said, yeah, we're going to give you all of these things? No, it's because social movements and protest actors have put pressure on politicians and policymakers to bring about this kind of change. So it's kind of people like you in this room, historically kind of young kind of students have been at the kind of vanguard and forefront bring about change. And so when I think about the impact of social movements and protests and peace building, when we're looking at Gaza and Israel, do you think it's just going to be about Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Netanyahu who's going to do this? No, it's going to be about sort of protest actors here in the US and colleges, campuses, putting pressure on these sort of politicians to actually bring about the sort of change which is required for a peace deal to happen. So when we kind of talk about peace or we talk about social change, for me it's always about bottom-up actors who have always historically created all the sorts of change which all of us, I think, in this room can benefit from. You know, the fact that I look at this room and I see kind of students from all different sort of demographics and parts of the kind of US, that's down to the impact and mobilization of social movements in the US.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really important things about social movements. You know, when we talk about the impact of social movements, the results, success, it's often very difficult to quantify. But when we actually think about it and think about just the direct impacts, but the indirect impacts, and over a longer period of time, we just see the major changes that are made and that wouldn't have been made without them. And some of the other issues that we've talked about over the last few days, the other issues that people have mobilised on, we've talked about a number, but two in particular that have come up are the environment and LGBTQ plus rights. So I wonder if Nidžara and Runa and John, if you could maybe speak a little bit about those issues and how they're bringing people together across the divide, and whether there's anything kind of particular about those issues that have a capacity to kind of draw people together in divided societies.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I'm coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Many of you are too young to know that that is a country in Eastern Europe that went through the genocide, which lasted from 1992 until 1995. More than 120,000 people were killed. And the biggest massacre was committed in the small town of Srebrenica, where more than 8,000 men and boys were killed over the period of 7 days. All of them are buried at the same place now in Bosnia and Herzegovina, those who are found. So living in that kind of society, post-genocide society, being survivor of genocide, and that's very difficult war. I was younger than most of you in the room when that, all of you probably, when that happened. Taught me many lessons, mostly about divisions and mostly lessons that are very painful, but at the same time it taught me many lessons about social movements, about the importance and power of the people, and the ways how people can overcome obstacles that are coming from the conflict, that are bloody, like the conflict that happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and try to build together something that is has a power to change not only their lives, but even to send a message to the world. I followed many different movements, but at the moment the strongest movement and the one that connects people in the countries that are divided by the war is their fight and struggle to save the environment. Bosnia and the Balkans, where Bosnia is very rich with water. We have lots of rivers, we have lots of forests, it's untouched nature practically. But at the moment, many investors from around the world are coming to this region, want to invest in hydropower plants. They're also doing, starting mining for lithium, or also trying to exploit forests in different way, and people got together to fight against this. Across the borders, they forgot about the conflict that divided them yesterday, and they tried to stop those who are destroying the nature. Effects of their struggle will save their lives. Literally, but also what people in the Balkans are doing in order to prevent this destruction of the natural resources is important for the entire Europe, because the Balkan is almost in the middle of Europe, so all these forests, of course, and rivers and everything, if polluted, if we lose them, the entire Europe will feel that. So that's the way how people kind of like came together after so many bad things that happened in the past, and they are trying together to find a way to live together, to live by each other, and to protect the nature that they depend on. So it's something that is happening in the Balkan at the moment.
Thanks very much, Nidžara. So there's this existential threat that is bringing people together.
Yeah, maybe staying in Bosnia before we jump to further
good
Ireland,
idea.
and maybe Lebanon. I'm not sure. You said got together. I quoted you on my paper. Got together
Immediate
to.
quotation.
I know. It's on Twitter already. No, got together to fight, and it's the same. So I've studied partially LGBTQ movements in Bosnia and Herzegovina specifically, and that's also something to rally together and fight for together. Your right to love the person you want to love, to be the person you are. That transcends ethnicity, right? Or could be both. You can identify as multiple things, not just one thing. And this is something that's come through in, so I've been doing interviews on the ground with LGBTQ activists and LGBTQ nonprofits, and kind of not necessarily, so either people can identify as different things, right? But at the end of the day, it unites them. If you're, so I don't know how familiar you are with Bosnia and Herzegovina, but if you identify as Bosniak, Croat, or Serb, you can also be gay or trans or whatever it is, and that you can have these identities. They don't exclude each other. They're there at the same time. So this is something that this community has worked together and put that at the forefront, and also speaking about it in the identity of human rights generally. I'll keep it at that. And then because John, you will also speak on LGBTQ movements.
Well, I was going to say something slightly different.
Okay.
I'm just going to say that
Diversity.
I just want to sort of put across how difficult it is for movements in these places to come across existing ethnic divides, because in places like Lebanon and Northern Ireland, there's high levels of segregation. You know, nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland live in separate communities. They may have sort of different jobs. Or in Lebanon, they even would go to kind of separate schools, universities, and so on. So there's sort of like little contacts between groups, and as I say, there might also be political parties which represent one ethnic group over the other. And then there's all sorts of kind of barriers beyond that. You know, even to vote, sometimes your political leader who represents your particular ethnic group would give you money, or they might say, if you want healthcare, you have to vote for me. So the whole kind of system is kind of set up in a way which kind of stops what we call mobilization across divides. Or even there might be sort of rhetoric if somebody tries to join one of these movements where they're being called traitors for doing that because you're not representing your particular ethnic group or sectarian party or whatever. So, you know, I can't emphasize this enough, just how difficult it is. So when these movements actually do come across ethnic lines, I think they are really sort of powerful actors and agents of change in these particular places, because they do actually show that coexistence can actually occur in these places. You know, that people don't actually have to exist within their own sort of ethnic or sectarian communities. There's ways of actually imagining society and politics in which people can actually achieve things collectively and do stuff in which the good of a whole society is brought to the fore. So yeah, I think these movements are really sort of powerful kind of actors. I'm just thinking of one really good example. You know, I live in Northern Ireland, and you're probably aware that there's been a peace process in Northern Ireland. You know, there was a long conflict over 30 years in which 4,000 people were killed in an incredibly kind of small place. And a lot of kind of focus of kind of research is on how political elites come together to bring about peace. But in actual fact, one of the most kind of powerful ways in which peace was achieved was through the actors of protesters from across sectarian and ethnic divisions who came to the streets to say, look, we don't want violence anymore. We're kind of sick and tired of assassinations, and we're kind of sick and tired of being kind of scared. And they put so much kind of pressure on the politicians that the politicians felt as if they had to go into a peace process. So I guess what I'm trying to say, which kind of reiterates back to my sort of earlier point, is don't always look at the political elites and the political parties. If you want to kind of understand social change and political change in our society and in divided societies, it's really important to look at these, what we call kind of bottom-up actors.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, the availability of means that your generation has in terms of social media, you can make a YouTube video, a TikTok, and millions of people can watch it. This didn't exist in our time. In fact, we had no way of communicating with Turkish Cypriots when we were growing in Cyprus. It was divided like North Korea. Most of us have never met a Turkish Cypriot until we were 18 or 20 when we traveled to other countries in the world. There was no communication, there was no email. We only had radio. And there were some Greek Cypriots who were left in the north. So at 2 o'clock every day when you come to school, there were messages to the Greek Cypriots who were on the other side of the divide through the public radio. So if you wanted to announce that you were getting married, and Neo is getting married on Sunday, and he's saying hello to his relatives back in the other side of the divide, and that was publicly announced, and the whole island would know about it. So we moved from a position that was a limited communication to a world that everybody can have their own channel, and everybody could have a massive number of followers in the social media. We're experiencing that level of revolution. But even in those difficult moments in deeply divided societies, one should remember that we were sharing the same environment. an anecdote from the 1970s. The mayor of Nicosia invites, along with his counterpart, the Turkish Cypriot, the two leaders. They give them a lavish dinner. At the end of the night, they said, "You can't use the toilet. Nicosia doesn't have a sewage system. And if we keep using our toilets the way we do, we're soon going to have an environmental disaster in Nicosia. You need to let us dig and create a sewage system. We're not going to cause any trouble to you. We're going to do it very silently, not to expose you politically. But unless you do this, there's no way we can move forward." And that was one of the major successes of the peace activism in the 1970s. They're trying to, even though Nicosia was on the surface, deeply divided, underground, there was all this work that was taking place by engineers and municipalities that prevented an environmental disaster in the city.
Powerful way to make that point. Thanks, Theo. Thinking about identity, these movements very clearly are inherently intersectional. They mobilise people across different ethnic, national identities, among many other identities, gender, sexuality, race, and the list goes on. So I wonder, how do these movements manage that diversity and that intersectionality internally? I know, Nidžara, you talked about even soldiers who fought on different sides of the war now mobilising together for the protection of forests and other environmental issues. And do they have the capacity to maybe promote a broader shared or civic identity in those places? Maybe we can start with Siobhan, and then anyone who wants to jump in.
I'll say just a couple of things. One is, I've started with the story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition Party. Sometimes these cross-community engagements also become quite romanticized in the literature, as though this is the way that peace is going to be made, that you bring people together across the divide. Those are examples of intersectional kinds of communities or actions. But there are other ways in which people organize within their communities that are also intersectional, but they don't tend to be the ones that attract kind of international funding. So international funding bodies at a time of a peace process love to support these kinds of cross-community groups or cross-community engagements because they fill us with great hope when we hear about them. So I know in Northern Ireland, lots of activists said to me it was very frustrating when the peace funds that came from the EU demanded that their applications always include a cross-community component. And activists said to me, we need to heal within our own communities as well. We need to bring ourselves together, working class, as well as professional class, people from different areas. We need to come together and heal in the post-conflict context. So sometimes when we think about intersectional and cross-community, we also sort of miss those kinds of engagements, which are also really intersectional engagements as well, where people are negotiating identities and working across different kinds of experiences. I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is another good example of that, where lots of money in the post-Oslo. Oslo was the peace process in 1993, peace agreement that was thought to usher in this period of peace, which of course Oslo failed because here we are today with the conflict. But there was lots of money in the post-Oslo context for these kinds of cross-community engagements, Israeli and Palestinian women working together. But there's also amazing feminist activists that were working within those communities, Israeli Jewish activists that were organizing across sometimes linguistic and other kinds of identities, and thinking about how those are important for informing their politics of peace, to advocate and to push their government to get back to the negotiating table. For Palestinian activists too, feminists, in the West, even just within the West Bank, there are different ways in which people live in camps, but also within cities, and then organizing with Palestinians that live within the state of Israel and within Gaza, and then internationally as well, and negotiating all of those kinds of identities in order to push for change at different sites of power within the Palestinian Authority, in this case, within Israel, and within the US or internationally at the UN. So the kinds of engagements, when we think about intersectional engagements, I think sometimes in the literature we romanticize those cross-community engagements and we define communities in very ethnicized ways, but there are ways in which people are negotiating identities within those communities as well that are really important for informing a politics of peace.
Yeah, and by kind of thinking about it in just terms of like the different ethnic communities, we're almost reinforcing that binary and missing the actual real intersectionality.
That's right, yeah.
Thanks, Siobhan.
Yeah, so in the case of the Balkans, it's in Bosnia concretely, it's a bit different. We speak the same language. We lived for a very long time in one country. We share music, we share literature, we share different like culture. So even during the war, in the worst kind of like stages of war, people did not lose the contact. And after the war, they kind of like kept that contact. Of course, there are divisions and there are consequences of war, but especially when it comes to things like environment, it's kind of like easy for people to find a way, easier for people to find a way to come together because they are united in something that is a common interest. But in general, what did happen during the war and after the war in the country for people to kind of like overcome this or to go beyond these ethnic identities or like whatever people identify with, culture was a very important thing. Music kind of like saved our lives. And the first places where we got together during the war and after the war, immediately after the war, from different countries in the region, was at the concerts, actually. And still, I think that the cultural events are the things that are keeping us together. Not only keeping us together, but also keeping us in touch with the rest of the world. So like in the middle of the war, Sarajevo, the city where I am coming from, we lived under the siege. It's one of the longest siege in history. It means that we were 24/7 like surrounded by guns and that shooted at us. We didn't have water, electricity, anything. But in these kind of circumstances, people find that what we are missing is a very simple thing. We wanted to go to cinema. We wanted to have a concert. So people did get together and created events that we were sitting together and like running away from the war. And that was very important part of like building a peace and also creating some different identities and understanding that there is something much more important than ethnicity or anything else, but something that put us together all the time.
Yeah, just the importance of that point just really underlines the importance and the power of culture and music, even in the midst of war, that people still have that need and desire to.
Yeah, especially in the cities, but also it's a normal life. You just need that. I mean, if you are used to have that, if you are used to go to concerts, let's say, and if music is important, but also sometimes you need a way to run away from the rest of the horrible world that you are surrounded, and then the culture is kind of like a safe place, and and then you don't even think about how different or if the people who are around you are different, because you are united in loving something which is, or appreciating something which is outside of you. And for us, it was music and culture, and now it's environment.
Yeah. It also reminds me of during the Troubles, one of the themes that was cross community and thriving throughout was punk, the punk scene.
Yep.
So, yeah. Neil?
And poetry as well in the case of Northern Ireland. Fakhoury says in his new book, The Belfast, that every neighborhood had a poet. Right? In the case of Cyprus, another major innovation and success of the peace movement was the creation of technical committees. Technical committees were established by the two communities, and they were involved in issues of education, issues of gender. The most successful one was the Committee for the Cultural Property. They were involved in restoring ancient monuments, churches, mosques across the island. On the Greek Cypriot side, there was a decision not to touch any of the Turkish Cypriot buildings. So anything that used to belong to the Turkish Cypriots fell into custody of the Committee for Turkish Cypriot Properties. Refugees could use it, but they could not alter it, they could not demolish it. And so the most beautiful parts now of the towns, because everything else was widely developed the last few decades, is the Turkish Cypriot town. Which looks exactly how Turkish Cypriot towns looked like in the 1960s. So you enter many of our cities, you have the neoclassical areas where the schools are, with the Greek Cypriot parts, some touristic areas, but then you get these very beautiful areas with Turkish Cypriot houses. The street names are exactly as the Turkish Cypriot left them in 1974. It's worth visiting some of these places because culture can teach you important lessons on how you could manage conflict, how you could vision, how you can bring people together to imagine their past and also imagine their future.
Please. I was kind of thinking of my own experience teaching back in Belfast. So I teach kind of students who come from both kind of Irish Catholic and British Unionist sort of backgrounds. So they went to separate schools, they lived in different areas, and then once we come to the university, we're in a kind of classroom together for the first time. And you know, we don't want to talk about sort of conflict because we just don't feel comfortable talking about conflict in a sort of public forum. But when I think about the impact of kind of social movements in Northern Ireland, what I'm seeing from my kind of students is they're talking about issues in intersectional ways. We're beginning to understand how, say, issues to do with socio-economic inequality in Northern Ireland can't be understood unless you talk about gender inequality, about racial inequality, about sort of the impact of the environment. How does that sort of impact upon sort of different groups? So we're making all of these sort of connections in this kind of new and unique way. And we're beginning to think about issues in a much more sort of coordinated way, I think, compared to sort of 10 or 15 years ago. And I'm kind of wondering if one of the reasons for this is the kind of success of these sort of intersectional social movements which we've had in the North over the last kind of 20 years, who've really been making these sort of connections between gender inequality, LGBTQ rights, social economic inequality, and so on. So when we think about the impact of these movements, it's not always about policy, it's about changing people's attitudes and how people conceptualize issues. So I'm beginning to see with my kind of students that we can talk about issues in an intersectional way, which is really exciting and I think important.
Think about, we're having this discussion, of course, as we mentioned in the context of the war in Gaza. We've seen huge mobilization, including on college campuses in the US and elsewhere, on this issue. I just wonder, thinking about those protests through a social movement lens and a social movement across the divide lens, how might you all kind of assess the impact of those protests to date, or the potential impact that they may have?
I could start. I am so filled with optimism as I see students building encampments on campuses all last year, and then now that we are all back on campus again, to begin to see and hear the murmurs of new kinds of movements and meetings that students are having it's incredible. It's exciting. And I know for many of the encampments, these are quite consciously intersectional spaces as well. So I can give you the example at my own university, at the University of Alberta, a student-led movement, People for Palestine, organized an encampment. It included all kinds of different students as well as faculty members. They built a lending library so that they could all learn together and think together. Unfortunately, it lasted only 2 days because after their first Shabbat meal together, in fact, the university called the police, and the police came in with riot gear and dismantled the encampment quite violently. But the idea has not died with that encampment, and it is only one example of the kinds of actions that students are taking on my campus and further afield. I know that as campus has returned now, although I'm on sabbatical, I'm still on all the listservs, and I see the different kinds of communities and people that are speaking up and drawing attention to our own complicity in Canada, our complicity in terms of foreign policy making, voting at the UN, weapons sales to Israel, all the ways in which we are complicit in the war in Gaza right now, and the role that we could play in a ceasefire. And so it's very exciting to me to see that cross section and lots of different people making those kinds of connections and demanding of our government and of our institutions as well to divest from the corporations that are making this war possible. So I think those are quite intersectional engagements, but there's other examples too. So many of you perhaps started or participated in teach-ins on this campus or in others online. It's incredible with Zoom. We all got so proficient at meeting each other online and in the COVID period. So at a time when we were all so isolated, we found new ways to meet each other. So we're sharing ideas, organizations, Palestinian feminists organizing in the United States have been developing amazing podcasts and teach-ins online that have been accessible to people around the world. And so there's that kind of engagement that we have today that fills me with so much optimism that it might just be possible to see a change happen. And I think we are beginning to see that tipping point now where saying ceasefire is no longer seen as somehow a radical claim, but to call for a ceasefire is a moral and ethical claim. And I think that is the move of the social movements, it is the move of these encampments, it is all the learning that we've done together that's made it possible to get to this point. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm from Sweden. I don't know if anyone's been. It's a nice place, but it also has kind of a history of a lot of social movements, like from way back in the day, a lot of workers' rights movements, and also a lot of student protests. We like to have a good protest in Sweden. I particularly think that students play a very critical role in protests. I mean, I think that's kind of I still want to say I'm young. I'm going to say
you are
our role.
Definitely on this panel.
To kind of push these issues forward. When I was a student at Villanova, I had I participated in a few protests. I will say this campus, from my experience, is quite calm. I don't know, maybe it's different nowadays. But I actually had to look, because I've been living in Belgium and Bosnia for the past few years, so I had to see what's going on at my old campus. I went to Uppsala University outside of Stockholm in Sweden for my undergrad to see what is going on there, because of course after all the protests that started happening here in the US, it kind of became a wave over to Europe as well, and you can see it now in almost a lot of countries in Europe, students protesting encampments outside of universities. Of course the environment is a bit different in terms of kind of the relation and history of the Israeli-Palestine conflict and how it's discussed in Sweden versus how it's discussed in the US. So there has been protests, and I had to see, has anything come out of this more, concretely, and what are they asking for in the Swedish context. So what's happened is that, at least at Uppsala University where I went, there was encampments outside of the university, but and they were taken away from the police after a certain amount of time. But what's happened now is that the encampments have moved to the government, the Swedish Riksdag in Stockholm, because the universities, who are all state-owned, has said, well, actually, this is a decision of the Swedish government has to come out with a stance before we can take any action. So this is what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. The Swedish government actually encouraged universities to cut ties with Russian institutions. So, and since they moved, nothing has really happened. But I did see that in our neighboring country, Finland, in Helsinki University, actually due to the protests by students, they have cut ties with a few universities, and which is a direct result from the student protests. So there's definitely something there.
Thank you.
Well, of course, it's very different being Bosnian and talking about these things. First of all, most of the people in Bosnia see what's happening in Palestine as a genocide. We do not demand ceasefire. We demand that genocide is stopped immediately now. And we are survivors, so we know to recognize genocide. We don't need UN or whoever to tell us how genocide looks like and how painful it is. It hurts us every time when I see what's happening in Gaza and Palestine. I can feel it because it's the same like what I survived. And that's why I have a right to call it differently and to demand something different than the others are demanding. So yeah, I'm demanding that the genocide is stopped, and it's stopped now. Looking from Bosnia, small country, not important country, nobody is listening our voices, but then we are listening other people's voices. So listening voices that are coming from different Western countries, including US, and protests. And I see a lot of young people in these protests, not only on campuses, but also outside of campuses. It's encouraging, but I'm cautiously optimist. And I will be more optimistic the moment I see your parents together with you on the streets, because it's too much to demand from your generation to change the world, that we, and sorry to use this word, fucked up. And I expect more of your professors to be with you. That moment you will be strong. Like this, very often, your generation is dismissed as very young, and a generation that do not have enough experience, so you don't know this, blah, blah, blah. So I'm waiting, and we are all, the rest of the world, is waiting for the moment when we will see your parents and more of your professors together with you on the streets, when they will put their bodies in front of your bodies against the police and those who are beating kids in campuses and on the streets. And that will mean the change. As long as you are alone on the streets without them, I don't believe you can make a big difference. And as long as you don't listen to voices of people like me and similar people who are ready to recognize what is happening, you will have a problem, because we have to call the names, the things, the right language is important. So we have to name the things like the properly, and to recognize what is happening around us in order to stop the evil. And in this case, it's genocide against the people of Palestine.
As in the case of Bosnia, both the Greek and Turkish Cypriots are united on this issue. I think there's certain events in human history that allow people to move beyond their ethnic identities and narrow conceptions of geopolitical interest. In the past, Turkish Cypriots were closer to the state of Israel. Later on, Greek Cypriots took that position. There was a switch in terms of who was supporting whom in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But Cyprus essentially implicated beyond the starting point through the British bases, as I mentioned, because the British bases are being used as a hub by the British government to engage in the conflict, with the subsequent fear that there might be a retaliation from Hezbollah against Cypriot island territory. So that's a further complication because Cyprus is not just one party that is further away. It's not Ireland, it's not Sweden, it's not Bosnia. It's in the region with responsibilities. The Cypriot government has offered its territory for a humanitarian corridor. Technically, that was not possible. So it's a big question there why we couldn't do that in terms of engineering and in terms of emergencies. The two conflicts historically have been studied together. That's another commonality. Back in the 1960s, one of the first bi-communal conferences, one of the first conflict resolution workshops happened on Cyprus by an Australian diplomat called John Byrne, who invented this method of conflict resolution. And one of the participants was a Jewish professor called Herbert Kellman, who used the same method in Israel-Palestine. He went to Harvard. He established a Journal of Conflict Resolution. He established a negotiation approaches at Harvard that many of you are probably familiar. And he worked for years between Israelis and Palestinians, bringing people together. Sometimes he came to Cyprus. He was our keynote speaker in one of the pre-Mitchell conference in 2008, talking to Greek and Turkish Cypriots and recounting on all the experience. I was very proud of young Cypriot activists from both sides of the divide. They came together and they organized last May a workshop that brought on not only Greek and Turkish Cypriots, but brought participants from Greece and Turkey, as well as Israelis and Palestinians. So amidst of what was going on in the Middle East, we were in Lydra Palace working with them. And one of the Cypriot activists was a student of Herbert Kellman, Maria Hagipavlou, offered to us a two-day training of how Kellman himself developed this approach. Mediation is not an alternative to protest. I think they're complementary. I think they serve each other. We should always be ready, even if when we protest what's happening and what we consider to be a genocide, we always be ready to talk to the other side. I think that's a key lesson in conflict and conflict resolution, while being honest and being clear about our positions. We can still mediate. Is maybe the next step in what needs to be done in many parts of the world, including Israel, Palestine. But when the activists came to us and they said, we're going to do this workshop with Israeli Palestinians, so there's no way this will happen. And they managed to pull this through. I was very proud of them.
Great. So I believe quite a few of you are studying comparative politics, and this is your first week.
Second week.
Probably wondering, why am I here on a Thursday afternoon? But, do you feel sort of optimistic about US politics? Do you feel sort of optimistic that your vote can make a change in the election coming up? Do you feel optimistic about the power of political parties in the US? Probably on the whole, from what we know about young people, they feel as if there's a democratic deficit, as if, our political parties aren't really making the sort of change you want to see. But another way of kind of looking at this is when we try to understand many of the key changes which have occurred in US society over the last kind of 60 or 70 years, they've been created by people like you in this room on university campuses through kind of street protests. African American civil rights took place on US campuses. The campaign against US involvement in Vietnam started in US colleges. Questions about LGBTQ equality, anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, of course, have all kind of occurred within US campuses. So the kind of change which has been created, I think we need to kind of look at the role of students on US campuses. And why do they kind of create this change? And I think there's a kind of number of reasons why they do this. Is protests can become sort of visible. The media picks up on protests, so they report about it. When people read about these protests, it can change their mind about a particular issue. How many of us were particularly aware about the genocide ongoing in Gaza until the protests actually began. You know, we might have seen the odd article in the New York Times, CNN or whatever, but suddenly when the protests began, or kind of Black Lives Matter, people become aware of these issues because the media is talking about this. And what we see is the more the media actually kind of reports on these issues, it has the power to change people's minds on these particular issues. And through doing this, it can actually kind of change how people vote, how people behave, and how people kind of respond to the society in which they live in. So although you may feel pessimistic at times about US politics, and I know about this because my wife is from the US, she's from Rhode Island, and we come back a lot. And you know, I talk to my US family about US politics, and I get very sort of depressed. But I think, you know, if we kind of ignore the Democrats, Republicans, and think about the power of young people to affect social change in the US, that's actually quite an optimistic kind of story historically. So hopefully I can empower you by thinking actually you do have this capacity to create change if you know, look at all of these major changes which have occurred in US society over the last 50 to 100 years.
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, so we talked about potential for policy change, but also another impact being learning and increasing visibility, and I think maybe most importantly, we've talked about like shifting mindsets and consciousness, and that's obviously the hardest thing to quantify, but perhaps the most important outcome from many protests, many social movements. So I'd like to open the floor now. We're really interested in your perspectives on all of this. I'd like to invite questions from the audience, students in particular, but also faculty and members of the community who are here with us. Okay, see a hand there. Yeah.
I have a question.
Please.
I'd like to ask, how effectively do you think that the Palestinian rights movement has kind of reckoned with like anti-Semitic extremism within the movement, and how effectively do you think it's prevented anti-Semitism from undermining the point they're trying to make about the genocide in Gaza?
I think I would say that it's impossible to think about the rise of anti-Semitism without also thinking about the rise of anti-Palestinian racism. The two of them come together in ways in which I think that these social movements and Palestinian activists and Palestinian solidarity groups have thought about and reckoned with really carefully. And I think if we seize that moment and we pay attention to the ways in which the kinds of racism that inform the rise in anti-Semitism are part and parcel of the kind of racism that informs anti-Palestinian racism as well. And we would do well to think about those two together and to address both simultaneously. And I think social movements and many of the kinds of communities that I have found myself in, especially over the last 11 months, have thought about that very carefully.
Great, Jackie.
So I have a question about social movement on the dilemma between the peace movement and nationalism. For example, the people, many movements, like Stand With Ukraine movement, the initial goals for them, the primary goals of this movement is for peace. But people on Ukraine, the Ukrainian politicians, they are not, they are against peace. There is the largest social group of Ukraine. His name is Byrne, and he told on his telegram, if Vladimir Zelensky, the president, if he go to the negotiation, we will launch a revolution and kill Vladimir Zelensky. So this is a kind of dilemma between the nationalism and peace movement. And this situation also happens between Israel and Palestine. So how could we explain a dilemma or solve it, or is it just a paradox?
Thanks very much for the question. I should have said, if you don't mind introducing yourself as well when you're asking the question.
I'm Daki, and I'm a freshman from Villanova University.
Thanks,
I'm
Daki.
major on poli sci, and I currently work for currently as an internship for the American.
Thanks, Jackie.
Who
would like
take
to?
That to maybe somebody else.
Yeah, the dilemmas in Ukraine is indeed between engaging in peace negotiations or maintaining the war. And often my own position, I have written on that, a couple of articles on how we can solve the issue in Ukraine. There could be a lot of solutions in Ukraine. If you look at UN resolutions, if you start from there, on other conflicts, where both the United States, Russia, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, China, all of them have agreed. If you take those resolutions and apply them to Ukraine, you know exactly what will happen. The idea that there is no common ground is a false one. You can use some of those ideas from elsewhere. And that's perspective I'm coming from peace studies, that we can engage in those negotiations. The response from the Ukrainians, apart from what you have described, is that this is what you have decided in Northern Ireland. This is what you decided in Cyprus. You're free to do whatever you want in your own country, but in our own country we decide to keep fighting because we consider that what happened to us was completely unjust. We're invaded by Russia, and you need to respect that, and you need to support us because we remove nuclear weapons, you gave us guarantees. So I think Ukrainians have a point there as well. I wouldn't have taken the position of Zelensky. I will agree with you that a peace agreement is a better choice for Ukrainians themselves. But at the end of the day, this is also their own decision, right? One has to respect that. I'm just alarmed by the amount of damage that has been done in Ukraine, by the casualties for Ukraine, by the displacement. I don't think it's a benefit of Ukraine to maintain a nationalist view. And often the people engage in debates and in a false dichotomy. They think that if we do a peace negotiation, that would deprive us from continuing to resist an aggressive invasion. I think that you could always engage in negotiations, and if the other side doesn't reciprocate, that makes actually the opposition stronger to demand support by the international community. So the dichotomy, Zelensky goes and makes peace versus continuing the war, it's a false one, because yes, he needs to open to negotiations, in my view, and if these negotiations, if reasonable concessions that have been applied elsewhere are not accepted by Russia, by Putin, then yes, Zelensky needs to get support by the international community. So I think we need to go beyond what we often think as peace agreements versus maintaining a strong position in the war front.
Thanks very much, Neil. Other questions? James?
Hello, my name is James. My question regards social movement not often discussed in
Sorry, can you
So if you can speak up a little bit, James, then thanks.
My name is James. My question is regarding social movement Just Stop Oil. Why might this business Just Stop Oil believes that they like to protest to other people and that kind of in a variety of forms, like sitting in the way of public transit and spray painting public buildings. Why might a social movement believe it is better to protest to other citizens than directly to the government itself?
Interesting question. So if everyone heard that,
Can I just ask, do you have Just Stop Oil here in the US? I'm not sure if you've seen the protests, have you? In one protest, so these are kind of environmental activists, and in one protest, they threw cans of tomato soup up against a Van Gogh painting, which is worth 20 million. What other kind of protests have they done? They've stopped kind of traffic in really sort of busy urban places. Some people are commuting to work, and I talk about this with my kind of students, and I play kind of videos by Just Stop Oil, and I'm kind of interested in whether kind of students kind of engage with it. And most of them say, no, we don't like it. Why are they kind of throwing paint over, a valuable painting? Or why are they, basically lying on the road to kind of stop traffic? And I think once the students actually begin to sort of engage with what Just Stop Oil is saying, then we begin to sort of understand the sort of logic of it, because I think what Just Stop Oil are trying to say is, what's more sort of valuable in our planet, the fact that we can see this painting which is about sunflowers, or the fact that maybe in 50 years there won't be sunflowers? You know, the painting wasn't destroyed, it's kind of covered up in glass. Like, I've been to see this painting, it's in Amsterdam. It's kind of great. It's worth kind of $15 million or whatever. And I think the only reason why it's kind of worth kind of $15 million is because whatever, you know, just because of the way the sort of capitalist system works. But when we kind of think about the logic of kind of just way of saying that, what's more valuable? The fact that you can either see this painting, or the fact that you may not actually see real kind of flowers in 50 to 100 years. So once we begin to actually understand the issues which they're kind of bringing to the fore, we can have a much sort of broader discussion about these issues. The other thing which they're trying to do is create what's called the radical flank. And this is a really interesting concept in social movement studies. Basically, the radical flank is if you have people within the movement who do really radical, outlandish things, it makes the mainstream activists seem much more mainstream and kind of palatable to kind of ordinary people. So by having a radical flank, it exposes these issues, it brings them into the sort of public discourse, but it makes the other kind of activists who are much more moderate seem much more moderate and acceptable to ordinary people. I mean, the African American civil rights was a fantastic example of the radical flank and how the movement had sort of moderates, but also sort of radicals within the movement. So a combination of these kind of different actors within the movement can actually create more success in the long term.
If I may just add, like, I mean, when you direct your message toward everybody, we live in the systems where people elect the government. So that's why you send a message to the people, hoping that they will think better next time when they choose a government. And yeah, this painting or any other painting, that's a price put on it. I'm not sure any painting is worth 20 million. Like, what is there to be worth 20 million? Nothing. It's somebody who wants to make money put that price on it. So whatever. It's really not important. Like, really, comparison to what we're going to lose if this continue. And that's why it is important that people get the message, and then that people have the power. So every time when you see some protest that is acting in this so-called radical way, they're actually trying to remind all of us, it's us who have the power. So take that power and do something with it, change the government or whatever.
Oh, Runa, and then we'll go. Got a question.
Yeah, I just, because this actually reminded me not of this research that I've done, but just working with advocacy in Brussels, because I work in civil society organization and advocacy in public health when I don't do this research. So working mainly with tobacco and alcohol policy in the EU. And just in terms of, sometimes it's really freaking hard to reach government. Like, sometimes it's very hard to reach politicians. So just as an example, the EU Commission in the last 6 years have had more than 270 meetings with the alcohol industry and 14 meetings with civil society. And that's because it's really hard to get those meetings. But if you're a multi-billion-dollar company, of course the EU Commission will make a meeting time for you. So sometimes it can be more effective to do something publicly, and maybe that engagement can actually get you into the room and get a hold of those politicians.
Hi, I'm Amanda. My question was like based on the separation of like church and state and religion. Like, I feel like in the United States, sometimes like the solution seems clear to us because we always believe, oh, it's so clear. If it involves anything to deal with the church, then like get rid of it. Like with the unionists, like their opinions, like we don't care because that like has to do with like your religion. But I know it's more like complicated that we kind of just like make it like so simple. So I wanted to know like how like in your experience has like it gone like in the Northern Ireland experience, like Bosnia experience, like how do these communities, these divided societies go up? Like do they try to separate religion and like civil rights in the state, or like, how do they like try to like use that like or like comply with like religion and like these like civil rights?
In Bosnia it's different. We used to be part of Yugoslavia that was a communist country, so religion was not something visible. It was not forbidden. You could be religious inside of your private home and family. During the war, politicians used the religion as well as ethnicity to manipulate with people, and they keep doing it until today. But still, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, like it's very separated in many ways. Like, for example, you cannot get married only in church or mosque or whatever, but you have to do it in front of the state, and then you can go to church for yourself or something like that. So it does not play the role in this. I think it's very different in Ireland than in Bosnia. It really does not play that kind of.
Lebanon is an interesting example.
Yeah, Lebanon, maybe, but Bosnia, no.
In that respect, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, John.
Just going to say, you really cool T-shirt. I like your.
Yeah.
Do you actually really think there's a separation of church and state in the US, that religion doesn't play any role in US politics?
But we like to think it does.
I think religion actually plays a much more significant factor in politics over here compared to sort of back home in Northern Ireland. Church attendances are beginning to diminish in Northern Ireland. Religious figures don't have the same sort of power they did maybe 40 or 50 years ago. So I think religion is not always the kind of key way to sort of look at this. But it's really interesting when I come to the US, because obviously I do my research in divided societies, and you probably don't think of yourself as a divided society, right? But I think the US is polarized in so many different ways. Over sort of cultural issues such as abortion, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, over sort of Palestine genocide. I sit within my own kind of family in the US and Rhode Island. They're so sort of divided on so many issues that sometimes it's good to sort of take a step back and to think, actually, do we live to some extent in a divided society? And in what ways are we becoming quite divided and polarized on many issues?
Neil?
There were some very good examples of religious peace builders. Nuget Santal wrote an exceptional article that got an award for both South Africa and Northern Ireland of how they played a key role. At the Clonard Monastery, there was a priest who brought together the two sides on the nationalist side, and they negotiated a joint nationalist line in the negotiations, because the nationalists were divided before the Good Friday Agreement into the Republicans and the rest, STLP and Sinn Féin. So it was very important that they have a joint approach in the negotiations, and that was mediated by the church. The same in Cyprus, we had an engagement there of all religious leaders to call for their constituency, for their folks, to provide information for the committee of missing persons. So in South Africa was established. It was a gift to the Huguenots who lost their position in Europe and moved to South Africa and established South Africa. But increasingly the churches realized that they couldn't support anymore apartheid discourse. So there's an epistemic revolution in terms of condoning apartheid. So churches play a very important role there. In Cyprus, it's also, for anybody who wants to study it, the Turkish Cypriots tend to be more secular than the Greek Cypriots. But in the north, the Turkish Cypriots now are confronted with the presence of Turkish settlers who tend to be very religious. So you have a very religious group from Turkey with the support of Turkey versus a very secular Turkish Cypriot community who fears for their position. The religious leader is often someone from Turkey who is appointed. On the Greek Cypriot side, the church is extremely powerful, both because of its history and financial position, but because it's one of the few Christian churches where the leaders, both the bishops and the archbishop, is voted in elections. So you have proper elections, which happen with election committees, with polling, with leaflets, campaigning, exit polls with all bishops appearing in the divisions between a pro-Russian and pro-Ukraine fraction in the church, all displayed in the politics. So by the virtue of being elected, they have a lot of power because they won elections, right? The people voted for them. So what is fundamental here, which is, I think, is a key lesson in conflict resolution, is not to ignore actors and try to engage with groups that in the past we never thought that they would put their signature under a peace agreement, and bring them slowly to the logic of a peace settlement. That's a key, and that's what Northern Ireland and South Africa got right, in my view.
Great. Thanks, Neil. We'll do one final sweep for questions, so we might take a couple here. So anyone who'd like to ask a question? Chris, and then we'll go to Jackie, and yeah.
Hi, well, I'm Chris. I just kind of wanted to go and touch upon the point that you made earlier about the radical flank. I found your point very interesting because I feel like kind of in the U.S., like when it comes to radicalism and political parties, that it kind of increases party polarization, and then it makes a lot of kind of the moderates in the middle. It almost seems that people tend to dislike the radical sides because they think of it as the extremisms that draw people away from each other rather than pull them together to create like coherent decisions. So I was wondering that in the study of social movements and how radicalism plays into that, is it more looked as like a tool or a detriment per se with regards to how it's utilized in like kind of broad social movements?
John, do you mind if I just take one more and then we'll take them together? Jackie.
So I have a little bit like question about the deviation of the Balkan and also Turkey race area. So according to I was a research associate at SSES UCL when I was high school. So I read some papers and historical documents. The historical relations between the war criminal and Siberian Orthodox Church and also Croatian Catholic Church, they have some like significant relationship, especially the Ustashis, the Croatian Nazi organization Ustashis, and also the blessed bishop. He's a like kind of saint in Catholic Church, and they have kind of significant relationship, and also the church kind of protect those war criminals during the Yugoslavia wars. And also the ethnic conflicts are most based on the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic during the Yugoslavia. So I'm not sure. I cannot sure. I mean, maybe maybe I'm wrong. So maybe there is no kind of maybe religion put a like significant role during the ethnic conflicts.
Really interesting question, Dougie. We might tackle that one maybe afterwards in discussion, if that's okay, just given our time. But if you want to respond to Chris's question?
Sure. A really interesting question about the radical flank. I'm not sure if you guys kind of know about the history of how women got the vote in places like the US and the UK through the kind of suffragette movement. And when the suffragette movement kind of started, first of all, it was very sort of middle class sort of women using like street protest and pickets and balloting. And then suddenly you had a radical flank appear who were willing to use what we would call counter-terrorism, assassinating political figures, putting bombs in post offices, throwing themselves underneath horses. Please don't say it, I'm trying to justify political violence. I'm not. But what I'm trying to say here is that radical flank allowed the moderates to suddenly become seen as more sort of moderate and palatable to the kind of politicians, the government, and that was how kind of change was affected. There's some actually really fantastic research on this, radical flank and African American civil rights, between the sort of mainstream movement led by Martin Luther King. Only got so far, and then you had the Black Panthers coming along as a radical flank, willing to use sort of more extremist sort of methods. And I think the kind of civil rights movement recognized that if we had this radical flank, we had these sort of radical actors, then the government thought, okay, we need to actually start delivering more on kind of civil rights. Otherwise, we're just going to encourage these radicals to get even more sort of radical. Just one other kind of point on this. What is also kind of fascinating is how social movements use the language of academia. So the radical flank is an academic kind of concept. But I did an interview with some of the Just Stop Oil protesters, and they use the radical flank terminology to justify what they're doing. So they're actually kind of using this language to develop their tactics.
Thanks, John. Siobhan?
Yeah, maybe just because this might be my last chance to say something. I love the way in which we said just stop oil so many times in this room. And in some ways that kind of radical, though non-violent form of protest had us saying that very phrase over and over again, repeated in classrooms and panels and articles and interviews. That's incredibly powerful form of nonviolent protest. I also want to say something about the religion question, which is such a great question. I also want to say that sometimes the way in which we focus on religion feeds into that kind of binary logic that I talked about at the beginning. And it gets us into this mode of thinking, and conflict resolution mediators sometimes get this way as well, and sometimes our politicians sound this way, as though these are conflicts that are rooted in a kind of irreconcilable religious difference or some kind of ancient hatred. And it moves us away from asking really important justice-oriented questions about the results of a long period of British colonialism in the case of both Northern Ireland and Israel, Palestine, as well as moves us away from thinking about important justice questions around a protracted occupation and genocide today. So I'd like to end there. Thanks.
Great way to end. Byrne, would you like?
Just final words?
Final words,
okay.
or addressing the question / final words.
I don't need to address the question.
Great.
Final words. Okay, this might sound weird, but I was out running the other day, and when there's like fully cement asphalt on the ground, so it was fully cement running, and then in the middle of it, it was one purple flower. Like through the cement. Normally I don't like stopping when I'm on my runs because you're on a go, but I had to stop and take a picture because I thought it was so cool. And I would say that for me summarizes our workshop a bit, that even though like in these very maybe dark times, heavy times, that little flower, and then it was also purples, and I study LGBTQ movement, so it felt a bit symbolic. But I would say from the field work I've done, even though parts of it is very sad, there's definitely less hopeful parts of it, there's also a very few very important critical social movements that gives a lot of hope, I would say. So that's something I take away from this.
A lovely image to end with. Be the cover of your book.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, keep that picture.
It's difficult after this beautiful thing that Runa said, but yeah, thinking about this violence and radical, I'm radical in my demands that all the wars in the world stop. And I'm not afraid to be that. And we should not be. We should be really, really radical, demanding peace, demanding demilitarization, demanding stop of violence. When I say violence, for me it's very violent seeing all these homeless people on the streets of US, here in Philadelphia. It shouldn't be like that. Your government is using money to buy guns for this country and for other countries around the world, and leaving citizens of this country to die of hunger on the streets. It's much more disturbing than oil on Van Gogh or any other painting. I don't really care. So don't be afraid to be radical when you demand justice and peace. And that's me as a survivor, that's me as an activist, and that's me as a human being to other human beings. Like, demand justice, and the same thing for everybody around. Equality is very important, and we all have the same rights.
Thanks, Nidžara. Neo, final word?
Just a final follow-up point what you have said. The next decade will be the decade of major militarization around the world. The amount of money that is going to be invested in militaries and military technologies will massively increase, primarily because of what's happening right now in Russia, but also because of the fear of how China will be increasing its influence. This is resources that could have gone to the environment, that could have gone to poverty, that could have gone to your education and to your getting housing in proper prices. We're going to be deprived of that. Instead, the investment will be in the military sector. It's more likely that in the next few years we're going to see military conscription, mandatory conscription in many European countries. The debate has started in the United Kingdom as well. It might be unavoidable in places such as the United States if we have seen more conflicts happening. So your generation will be affected. And that's why you need to take action now so we can avoid going through that pathway.
John, do you have a
No, to say thanks and good luck with your studies, and hope I haven't depressed you too much. But I think what we're trying to emphasize here is actually, the power of social movements, and especially kind of young people, to affect kind of change. It's still the same as what it was with US American civil rights, the women's movement, and so on. So hopefully the optimistic story is you do have that capacity to bring about the change you want to see.
Thanks very much, John. So far from depressing, I think it's been actually a really inspiring and empowering discussion. And yeah, I've learned a lot from panelists and from you as well. So thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of the audience.